Okay. So this lecture is mobility and relaxation, and then suffering through attachment of the life force to negative situations. So it's sort of two different lectures, and I kind of get the connection, but for me, they also kind of are two standalone things. So, and then, like I said in the beginning, he has these metaphysical kinds of uh, revelations about, you know, life force and life substance and sort of how we consciousness impresses it and all of that. And I think it's useful to try to envision there's some actual people now in quantum physics, and I think this guy's a neuropsychologist too. It's like he's a um, and he has this way of kind of doing mathematical testable formulas, you know, for looking at, you know, like there is no reality outside of the conscious agents, you know, and kind of more of this stepping into wrestling with kind of quantum level of physics and kind of stepping out of our kind of Newtonian assumptions and background. And so I like, and I think the guide gives us some, you know, ways of exploring this, you know, to look at this deeper metaphysical reality that we're coming from, and maybe even it's the physical sciences starting to begin to catch on to the similar things now. So he says the entire universe is permeated with a vibrant life substance. This substance consists of forces of such tremendous power that people have only begun to discover them vaguely and to a limited degree. Whether this power be physical, such as electrical or atomic power, or mental power, makes no difference, for it is all the same power, or different facets of the same power. This power is very impressionable mass, a substance that can be governed and molded only by consciousness. The result of this molding is matter in its various degrees of density. It is also something more subtle than particular matter. However, it is life itself as it unfolds for the individual. So it's like interesting, here we go from kind of this particulate, almost, you know, quantum level of description that, you know, is, you know, where consciousness is molding matter, and there's a kind of impressionable, you know, material, and that the molding creates these degrees of density, which I think is, you know, not too far off from a current understanding of physics in some ways. So, but then he goes, it's even more subtle, and he says it's really also then expressed in circumstances, fate, or destiny, if you will. So in a way, you know, our whole vibrational being, you know, our different levels of our field, you know, our all of the different conscious and unconscious things that we carry, right, is also in a way affecting and manifesting as fate and destiny. And you know, and in some ways, you know, it's like resonating, and it's a feedback circle, and, you know, we're, you know, responding to it, and then it responds to us, and that kind of thing. But I like to work with it, you know, as kind of like when you're driving down the road, you know, it's like the future is coming towards us, you know. It's like when I stand on the river, the creek, I often feel like the past is behind me, you know, and the source of the river, and the future is in front of me as the river flows, you know, forward. But, you know, it can be seen in either way, right? But there is this kind of sense of the flow of the life stream, and the, you know, journey that we're on, that creates the circumstances and the fate and the destiny. He says, whatever you experience and the conditions in which you find yourself, this is the matter or form, which is the outcome of the way consciousness impresses the life substance. this is a very brief recapitulation of everything I have spoken about in the course of these years. I repeat it here briefly to make the following more understandable. So, he's kind of helping also, if we understand this larger metaphysical principle of the flow, I guess, and also the way that the pleasure principle, can get hijacked and attached to negative things, is connected with this. So let's continue on. Is there any comment or question here? So this tremendous life substance is in continuous motion, which also sounds like the quantum field, right? It's empty, but it's fecund and it's popping in and out, and I don't know. Let us go a little more deeply into the meaning of this, into the particular method and rhythm of this cosmic movement. If you truly understand this, you do indeed have another key to your life. So this is another place he talks about, sort of the masculine vectored movement, and then this more, feminine, just life force vibratory, movement. But, here I think, he's really opening up to understanding this kind of flow that even I think in Silicon Valley, and I don't know, like it's a kind of the flow state, people talk about and other people are experiencing and exploring, getting into, right? And so I think that's a part of what this is describing somewhat. So he says that this tremendous life substance is in continuous motion. Let us go a little more deeply into the meaning of this, into the particular method and rhythm of this cosmic movement. If you truly understand this, you do indeed have another key to your life. This cosmic movement permeating everything that is a mixture of mobility and relaxation. The key of mobility combined with relaxation opens the world. It is the state of being, or the unitive principle of being. Only through misconception does duality or conflict come about. The particular duality or distortion of the unifying principle of mobility and relaxation results in the following misconception. On the one hand, relaxation is viewed as non-movement or stagnation, and on the other, mobility is viewed as tense effort. This is particularly important to understand because these misconceptions are the cause of humanity's predicament. So, even in this journey that I took, I don't know about like applying it in all circumstances, but I certainly can see like that there was this fundamental, non-dual approach to things that I was working with. And so, something was helping me as well. It was, the time, the journey itself, my guides, I don't know, but there was this kind of sense of, like the movement and the relaxation being one. And I would notice when I would lose that relaxation and I would start tensing, and trying to push the river, or, when I, was, instead of feeling heart-centered and hopeful, but not knowing how to go forward, or whatever, I would feel stuck or frustrated or something like that. And so, there was this overall general arching, kind of principle that seemed to be useful and working. And I know in the past too, a lot of my mobility and effort, right, did seem to come, and still probably does to, in varying situations, but that, there's a little forcing current, there's a little tension, there's a little pushing, a little, wanting to get it done to make sure it, is going to work, or, so there's not in this kind of relaxed flow. And there's more of this element of control coming in. And So I think, I could see, like how this was working. And I could see also how there's a kind of negative pleasure principle attached to sort of the making it happen or getting it done, kind of energy, that, oftentimes I'm aware of, and I'm not willing to let go of, right? There is a kind of, okay, let's just, let me do it first and then I can relax, right? So do you guys recognize some of this in yourselves?
Yeah, for me, the whole life is doing things quickly so then I can relax. And then I can't relax because I'm waiting for the next thing to do. It's crazy making.
Yeah, great. Yeah, and I think it is sort of Western consciousness in some way that we're all infected. This is some level of Wetico that we're all infected with as well. So if you can, just for a moment, even sort of try to unify them, try to imagine, right? Because the guy is saying, we have to be able to imagine a possibility before we can actually, have to conceive of it in order to manifest it, right? So like in your own individual cases, see if you can think of a circumstance of doing where you can actually visualize yourself, doing it from this more relaxed place. And if not, what's there instead, just explore a little internally. What does this look like? How can we imagine movement without a pushing current or a doing aspect, but just one of my hymns talks about, well, let the river carry you, move, but relax into the movement that's larger than you, right? So there's maybe an image of seeing life moving through you. And, and in some situations it's more active and you're doing, and others you're not, but, your whole life is kind of unfolding through you, moving through you, and you were, like on this river yourself, and it's taking you. And some of it, you might be steering or aiming towards, a particular bank or, whatever, but, it's like there's only a limited amount, right? That all of it is coming from these deeper unconscious waters within us. And so the guide is saying, we need to learn how to steer the ship, but we can't just do it by superimposing control. Like we really have to kind of learn how to, move with this in an organic way and not avoid, the places where we need to go through the rapids, or we need to go, into some dark descent a little bit, because oftentimes, it's that movement that is needed. It needs to move, come into the light, and can then heal, can then transform in some way. But when we keep, holding on to it or shoving it into the unconscious, or, thinking that we're supposed to control the river and not let all of this stuff surface, that, I think what we're really, the life we're living is held back in a way, and we don't have the full benefit, and that doesn't mean that we act out from these dark places either, or get lost in them and identified with them completely. But I think if we can, just sort of use this almost mythic image, the guide even gives us in the very first lecture, and it is a journey, and it is a, like forces that are bigger than us as well, in some sense, and it's ultimately all us, but, from the place of the identification with the small self, we have human experiences, and it's important, those human experiences. It's through them that we truly do the work. And so to not judge or reject or, try to, be a certain way versus how we are. But at the same time, to recognize that how we are in any given moment is, not our ultimate and final true self, and is a part of this healing journey that, we came here to, reveal these inner places that are needing the help and the healing. So, do you recognize, like, I think this is one certain way of looking at it, where I can remember when back when I was sort of bulimic, a lot of the depression, would, make me very frustrated because I would feel such stagnation. I didn't want to get up and do anything. And yet, I didn't want to just, do nothing either. And so, like, I was really trapped in this kind of place. And so there, I can remember Susan actually, encouraged me to let it go, to relax into it, to allow the stagnation, allow the non-movement. And the minute I could risk doing it for, a little longer than a split second, like it took my being, a while to be given permission, but as I allowed that and stopped fighting it inside of me, then the flow started again. And, I would begin to feel movement coming in and wanting to, get up and go back into life. So certainly back then, it was, part of, like a judgment that I held about, the stagnation that sometimes I would feel inside of me. And yet trying to force it to be different wasn't useful. And then, of course, we talked a little bit already about kind of the negative pleasure and, whipping ourselves into frenzies and, working very fast and efficiently, or, getting everything done, kind of like so we can relax. It has its own kind of pleasure that also, to me and my own being, allows me to sort of not be sensitive to other people. It's like I become insensitive to myself and insensitive to others, right? And it's all about the task and just get it done. And, and so I can not be in a relationship, which, like has freedom to some extent, I don't have to care about you, fuck you, like, and so there's, some perhaps negative pleasure in, that kind of sort of just like, I don't know what the word is I'm going for, but, like lack of relational kind of connection with others. And maybe it's a kind of autistic or other, kind of thing, but there is a pleasure in getting things done. And I know my parents also, were big into projects and, doing things. And I think there was a lot of enjoyment in them as well. But I don't know, often it was the enjoyment after the fact, right? And I don't know how much there was an ability to enjoy as they were creating. And so that's, I think, the other thing, is how can we be active, and yet receptive at the same time, and enjoying the journey, even though we might have an end goal or something like that.
That's a sticky wicket for me all my life, is productivity equals value, equals self-worth. And certainly I grew up with that, because if I produced around the house, did what mom said, then I could get some acknowledgement from her. Otherwise, it was dealing with a kind of a strange tornado woman who had to produce to have any self-worth at all for herself. But at any rate, it's now I'm trying to decipher the difference between being productive for self-worth versus following some inner deeper guidance on what to do and having the discipline to do it. So they get tangled at a lot of times. So I'm working with that.
Good, yeah. And I mean, I think there is a place for discipline, but I think, you know, partly for me, this, like, listen, it's kind of like finding the inspiration, right? Doing it from inspiration in some way. I don't know if that resonates for you. You know, sometimes I was kind of curious because I had this feeling I wanted to, you know, go visit all of these people. And originally it wasn't going all the way out to California, but in the long run, I was doing well and decided I would, you know, even go out there. And I don't even know exactly what I was following, right? But there was this inner yes in my being that wanted to do that. And so maybe it was something with my father's spirit, because he was always very connected with the larger extended family, you know. But you know, and even in the process, you know, I was kind of curious, you know, why am I doing this, you know? And mostly it was delightful. I loved doing it, you know. It was great to, you know, see everybody make the connection again. A lot of people I hadn't seen since kids, you know, this kind of thing. And yet, you know, like it could be that there was even more than I understand that was accomplished in that journey, you know, of kind of touching base and connecting with others, including my brothers. And, you know, it's the first time we'd been back together without mom and dad, you know, between us, or, you know, kind of being the central pole. So, you know, and a lot going on, a lot of, you know, still, you know, this life that is both amazing and miraculous and painful and difficult, you know, and always comes, you know, with sort of both and like that. So yeah, I don't know, like if that helps, Dick, but, you know, like if you can let Holy Spirit move you, right? And by that, you know, it doesn't necessarily mean completely like me, like, I don't know why I'm doing this, but it could be something that, you know, really does interest you, and let yourself, you know, notice that that's calling you. And then maybe there are blocks, or maybe there are, you know, resistances or hesitancies that then, you know, we can look at and work through. Does that seem connected? Like when you notice the...
Well, inspiration is an interesting word and concept.
It sounded like, and sorry to bother or break in again, but it sounded like when you said it that, you know, it was like somehow an expectation or a should, that you were still trying to harness your forces to do.
Yeah, there's something there, because there's this atrophy almost part of me that has this rule from long ago, childhood, that if I get everything done, then I can, you know, somebody used the phrase, you can pull down your pants and slide on the ice. You know, it's just like, that's what life is. You don't have to do anything, you know. And twisting that core around into a different concept than the opposite of doing constantly is a continuous challenge for me, and it's becoming kind of a fun challenge. I'm kind of I'm learning from it. It's and Joyce and I are both bouncing off of that issue, because she's a doer also, and try all these projects to do, and we're feeding off each other, trying to find that blend in the relationship as well, in the work we have to do in the relationship, and then the listening intuitively, if you will, into another form of what's next in life. Like I was saying earlier about doing this project on this sound wall behind me in my townhouse, is is getting more and more and more evolved, and I could get overwhelmed and say, all right, that's just more than I want to do, I've done, but it keeps growing and getting bigger. And if I can calm down and calm the brain down from my old programming, it's like, oh, this is interesting. This is a, let's see what's next, you know, and I'm feeling a little overwhelmed, but then there's something that says, here's the next step, here's the next step. It's usually small, but and I'm meeting really interesting people, having really interesting conversations, and
Cool.
it's and then all the fears are there, the big ones being I'm not enough, I'm not smart enough, I can't do it, and what do I think I am? And so it's very so I don't know how to describe that little something now that is pulling me that I'm honoring as opposed to ignoring because I don't want to have hassle in my life, you know. Something
Yeah.
like
And I think that is inspiration, and that is your willingness, right? You know, and that is like, you know, like how it goes, how we go forward, like, you know, following that step by step, you know, little by little, you know, what's the next step, what's the next, right? You know, and not getting ahead of ourselves, or not feeling like, oh, you know, I have to know it all or take it, you know, figure it all out already, or whatever, you know, and always having the possibility of, yeah, well, I may decide not, you know, I have free will, I may decide, you know, not to go further with this, but you know, everything you're describing sounds to me like, you know, it is a part of that learning to follow, you know, in that willingness, right? And in kind of stepping up or taking on. And like you said, you know, it doesn't mean that your resistance is not there, but it's like something else is there with it, right? That keeps you going forward, keeps you, you know, listening to this higher voice, which is what I would call inspiration, right? You know, that helps you with the next step, or, you know, has just that willingness, you know, and you know, without knowing the outcome or for sure or anything like that. So just keep following. So cool.
yeah, also the message tied in with that is on a bigger level, I have to let go of the results. That's another one I have to really hold on to as well. Otherwise I get crazy in it.
Exactly. Yeah. And that is kind of, you know, like, so anything that, like, you know, there is the yes to movement, you know, then that the movement is happening, you know, but then that's how our conscious mind can do, you know, kind of keep working with the transformation, is like noticing where the tension comes in, where the relaxation, you know, leaves, right? You know, and what the thought form is that you know, banishes it, and, you know, how we get kind of bespelled back into, you know, this energetic kind of forcing current, you know, or the ego attached, or thinking it, you know, it has to make it happen and control it in some way, instead of trusting in this larger, you know, like for us to claim our intention, you know, to call, you know, like, and become the space that, you know, can open and create the beauty, the miracle, the, you know, the next best thing, even when it's, you know, it's hard. And, you know, if we stay present, if we continue to trust in this mobility and relaxation, it carries us into and through and out the otother side of those hard places. And even
The
with,
phrase letting it unfold,
Mhm.
you're not, you know, not controlling it. And it's a pretty interesting ride when I can do that.
Yeah, yeah. And it's not that there isn't sometimes, you know, where you get very clear that, you know, there's some offering that you could give, you know, but it doesn't feel like it's superimposed upon it, you know, with this control, but it's just this subtle and skillful way of, you know, sort of adding something to the mixture that can, you know, help it move in a positive way or whatever. So, you know, seeing where there's some friction, you know, and opening your heart, and, you know, speaking truth with love, right? You know, it's like, it's always this loving, relaxed, you know, presence of the higher self that, like then as we navigate, we don't make ripples and waves so much, and so the calm and the flow doesn't get so disrupted in life. And I really feel like, we can, you know, always there will be challenges, always there will be, difficulties, but the more that we can learn, that kind of relaxation and that mobility and relaxation, the better that our journey can be, with whatever we encounter, and we can be a force of that, calm and transformation for others as well. So he's saying that the distortion of mobility and relaxation is the primary duality underlying all misconception. So that's a big statement there. I kind of get it. I would have to think of every situation to, kind of find it in each one. But I think it's just, to really kind of recognize this is a big deal here, the way that we go about it. It's not so much what we do, but the energy in which we do it. And so, this is this unified energy of this mobility and relaxation is what somehow, can help us calm the waters of life and help us, follow the currents in a good way. So he says the primary misconception distorts the harmonious rhythm of cosmic movement. That's where I kind of get this idea of, it's like whenever I'm, resisting and in my tantrum or, trying to control or whatever, it's kind of like I'm creating a bunch of ripples and wake, like, and trying to swim upstream. And, so it's like all of this is kind of taking the natural current that would carry me easily and now makes it all choppy and chaotic. And so then the results, become a little more disharmonious as well. Says you will experience this truth even more dramatically and personally when you listen to your soul movements, your own inner expressions and emanations. If you calmly observe what emanates from your own psychic forces, you will find this distortion of movement where you stagnate because non-movement seems so tempting. And that I think that's the other thing is like sometimes I'll, even when I feel kind of like I want to just crash out, sometimes I'll work with, okay, can I find a way of relaxing in the movement, and resting as I'm moving, right? Or, approaching this, from a peaceful, restful state, even though I'm active and doing something. But, it's like, and I think, again, we're always in these extremes, so non-movement, seems tempting, like finally we can just be. And there's a deep place in our soul that is so hungry for that being, right? That, it's like, again, like Susan told me, say, okay, so just let yourself stagnate, right? Like, because we're constantly forcing ourselves into the active way more than the receptive, right? And so we can never kind of reset. But that's ultimately not what we want, it's just stagnation, right? But in some way, until we can surrender to the desire just to stop, and the desire to, rest or to, just be, then I think, there's always a obsessive compulsive kind of energy to the movement. And I think we also have fear, it's the creative emptiness. I don't know, it's like, what happens if I stop? It's like, oh, now I have to feel, now I have to be with what's here. So, we distract ourselves as well. And then he says, it appears to be the effortless state, the non-movement that the soul longs for, or movement seems so necessary because we don't want to stagnate. And so our guilt whips us into striving and overly tense movement. And I know for me, like a lot of times there was that vicious circle in the bulimia, and the depression and stuff. So, like we can we can force ourselves again a little bit, and sometimes it even helps, but, it's like ultimately doing it that way just makes us long to not do it all, right? Because we're forcing ourselves, we're judging ourselves, we're critical, and it's like this ordeal, right? That who wants to do that? Like, let me just go hide under a rock, and pull the covers over my head. It's not a way to live. And so there's a life force, and a life part of our child maybe that just simply doesn't want to, keep going that way. Hi, Jasmine, welcome.
Hi, Darlene, missed you.
Yeah, good. Glad you could make it. We're kind of in the middle of this lecture a little bit, so hopefully you can listen to the recording. So did you get a chance to read it?
No, I didn't, but I'll go back and read it.
That's fine. Yeah. You can probably follow along. It's kind of like he's talking about this way of being in the flow of having this unified movement and relaxation at the same time, and how that kind of is a split that we move with tension, and we collapse into stagnation, to not move and to rest, and so we're kind of polarized in that way. And so he's suggesting that it's a very profound and deep way that we get torn into, and we try to control ourselves and make ourselves move when we think we should, and we're just trying to get through it so we can rest and not do anything and all of that kind of stuff. So it has a lot of deep effects in our happiness and unhappiness in life to explore. So he says, for a moment, that we can acknowledge the confusion and the distortions of our personal cosmic forces, and by acceptance, right? So again, we have to allow what's already there and not judge it, but by acceptance, by that observation or awareness, slowly but surely come near to straightening out the imbalance of motion. So as you proceed in reorienting your until recently unconscious, but now conscious concepts, values, understanding of life and yourself, as well as your relationship to life and to yourself, the movement begins to harmonize with the great cosmic flow. So there's a larger ocean, a larger river around us, and then there's our, personal flow, our personal life movement. And so mobility and relaxation comes more and more into our being. And he says the same applies to the physical level of existence. And as you observe the emanation of your thinking, feeling, and reacting, and consequently observe this particular imbalance, you will also see that the same imbalance affects your physical body. Since the principle of life itself is the harmony between mobility and relaxation, the phenomenon of dying must be the misunderstanding of this principle, so that a duality arises. And I think, I often see, as part of sort of like seeing this very clearly, even before I left on the trip, that every time I would go into my forcing current, or, into my, negative pleasure about something, my, complaint or my judgment, or, like I could really feel like, in the Bible, it says, the wages of sin are death. And it felt like that, it felt like, oh, I'm squandering my life force on this. And it did feel like I was draining, like precious life in doing that. And so again, like there's this longing for this state of life that is this balance and this beauty of this doing and being that are harmonized together. And so he says, when this misunderstanding, which is death, has proceeded far enough, affecting more and more aspects of the entity, the phenomenon of dying takes place on the outer level. But where a balance is established, life continues, and death is an impossibility. And so, I think, our emotion, most of us understand that the pathwork is pretty clear about this, like that the issues start out, in the mental or emotional or even the spiritual bodies, and then kind of chunk down into the physical body. And it's patterns that we have set in motion where the energy flows, around an image that's not true, or, around some, constriction, like when we go into tension, right? We block the flow of the life force in our body so that the nutrients and the life force can't get to all of the cells. And so we might, trigger something there physically. So he says the outer physical level follows suit automatically as the psychological imbalance is straightened out. And this does not mean, however, that you cannot also help from outside in by cultivating and learning from without the art of mobility and relaxation. So by working at it from inside out and from outside in, the process will be speeded up and the harmony established faster. This is very important for you to follow through, my friends. So, it's like, to me, what he's saying by the inside out, is like, so we just notice what's blocking, like, okay, we're in a forcing current, we're not in a mobility and relaxation state. So we can notice on the inside of us, why not? What's holding us into this place of, forcing or, active doing with pressure on ourselves and everybody else or whatever, and is not allowing the flow, the relaxation. Are you afraid? Is it like the guide says, we would all be very patient if we knew the outcome was certain. So when we don't have certainty, right, we get anxious and we want it done so we know the results are going to be okay. And so there's these ways that we, add pressure into the system and to become conscious, not again to control them, but to understand them and see what's happening inside. And then also to, actively intend and kind of try to cultivate this state from the outside, like, well, what is it like I've got this project, I've got this task I'm set to do, and let me time how long I I can do it, from a flow, or notice like when something doesn't go according to my expectation or plan, can I surrender to that? Can I let go and stay in trust in what the larger life force current, the larger river is, and not try to have to control that. Anybody want to throw in anything here? So then he kind of shifts into this, place where there's, like looking at some of the distortion in the lower self aspect of this, So he says, the question is often asked why destructiveness, illness, war, and cruelty exist. The answers that have been given are often not sufficiently understood. But even when they are somewhat understood, something is missing. So then he drops down and he says, Mere negativity, as in a destructive attitude, has a much less destructive effect than when destructiveness is attached to and combined with the positive life principle. So, and I don't know, somehow, I feel this, like I think whenever I'm, fighting to stay destructive, or, I can feel like I can't let it go, that then I would say that there must be some life force attached there to it. And oftentimes, the guide says it comes from childhood, where, it's like we're in a defense that, promises, somehow protection, in that. But so he talks about now going into how we end up in attaching, the life force to the negative situations. And he does say that this usually happens in childhood, but then if we don't recognize that as adults, then we don't fully understand, and can't quite transform it as easily as if we get that there is this connection. And he's saying, we're not doing it consciously, but that it's kind of like, I think in one of the other lectures, he talks about this too, where he says, we needed pleasure to live. So let's say, like our father was very abusive, like maybe we took on the persona of, I'm tougher than he is and he can abuse me as much as he wants, but I'll be tougher. So, at some level, it's like the fullness of life, the power of life, gets attached, in this situation where it's oppositional or, it's, trying to win over, somebody else's lower self, right? And so that probably won't work very well. There are many other kinds of examples where, we get our negativity, in the life force attached. I think for me, sometimes I don't even fully understand it, right? But that there does seem like there's a fight, inside, like a willingness to fight to the death almost, right? And we can feel that, and imagine that, somehow the power of the life force is involved. So he says, mere negativity, as in a destructive attitude, has much less destructive effect than destructiveness attached to and combined with the positive life principle. This is what makes negative manifestations on this earth plane particularly serious or severe. In other words, when a positive force mingles with a negativity or a destructive attitude, this combination creates evil. Real destructiveness is therefore not only a distortion of truth and of the constructive universal powers, but a distortion that must be permeated with the powerful life principle and its constructive power. So again, I think we've been, working a lot with this archetype of ex-President Trump, like as kind of someone that almost manifests, some of this huge, powerful life principle in some way. And yet, that there's all this distortion that we see. And he seems to, be able to, use it in this way, that we often see as very negative, but, it seems to be attractive in lots of different ways to other people. So if the positive life principle were not involved and inadvertently used, and I think in this case maybe advertently used, then evil or destructiveness would be of very short duration. The best way, my friends, that you can apply what I say here and derive more from this lecture than a vague abstract principle is by looking at yourself from the following point of view. All of you who are on this path have found certain hurts and pains you endured as a child. Some of you have begun to grasp, if ever so slightly, that at the moment when you were hurt, a specific process took place. The erotic or pleasure principle was put in service of your hurt. I can sort of remember, like being, hurt and going into my room, and kind of suffering in that pain, kind of like wallowing in it a little bit and hoping that it was hurting them too, and that kind of thing, right? So all the emotions arising from the original hurt, according to the character and temperament, also combine with the pleasure principle. So, the real true original hurt was much more vulnerable and much more, like really, affected. And so we don't want to feel that. And we don't want to feel the weakness of that, maybe the vulnerability of that. And so, we, find this way of, usurping the life force and avoiding that original pain. And then it becomes part of our character structure, our defense, and part of our negative patterns where we keep recycling into painful situations and suffering situations. So when you realize, after having become aware of this process, how many people, regardless of their outer actions, can experience the pleasure principle only in fantasies of cruelty, you will understand that this is the actual nucleus of war, of cruelty as a whole. So, and I didn't know that there were so many people, but sometimes, like working with others, you see through their eyes, certainly, people that seem to, really are, active in their fantasies of cruelty. And I don't know, like in the larger construct, how to apply this, but I think it's an interesting suggestion, right? That it really is, I mean, somehow pleasure in the fantasies of cruelty. And so this is, of course, where he's now coming into talking about sort of this early life force, and the child is erotic, right? Is generalized, not genitally sexual, but in a way erotic. And so there's a way that the sexual current also gets attached, and this is where we have sort of these tendencies towards sadism and masochism. And so we can either use it, we can take pleasure in being hurt, or we can take pleasure in hurting, in the being cruel or in receiving cruelty. And most of us have some little flavor of that, and where we can often discover it and detect it is in our sexual fantasies, right? What turns you on there. So this should not make you feel guilty. It should rather enlighten you and free you to allow your inner process to transform. For it is a misapplied and misunderstood hurt that has created this condition. Cruelty without the pleasure principle could never have real power. Lack of awareness of this combination of cruelty and pleasure by no means alleviates the effect it has on the overall climate of humanity's emanation. So the lack of awareness, right, is not helping. So if you have experienced cruelty, whether this act of cruelty was an actual fact or a creation of your imagination, your pleasure principle is attached to cruelty and functions somewhat in connection with cruelty. Often the guilt and shame are so strong that the entire fantasy life is denied, but sometimes it is conscious. Awareness of this must be established and understood from an overall point of view, for if it is truly understood, both guilt and shame will be removed. As understanding grows, the pleasure principle will gradually respond to positive events. So, by suppressing and being bad for, our negative attachments, that doesn't allow the change again, like this again, mobility has to happen. And so when we resist something, when we judge it, we freeze it, we stick it. And so this allowing, the awareness and the, being without the shame and guilt, allows this process of natural transformation.
That's where the Catholic Church blocked me big time with guilt and shame and confession and oh my God, for a lifetime, for much of my lifetime. Yeah. Even when I know better, it's still there.
Yeah, it's very deep inside, and this is where sort of the re-education can be very helpful, because, it's like, in a way, the guide is saying, like we have to become our own inner authority over everything. And so that was a situation where, this top-heavy authority, as a child, came down and became authority and imprinted in your soul substance and that kind of thing. And in a way, your true authority, your own higher self, your own adult understanding has to go into the same place where it was imprinted. You can't just kind of vaguely know it. You have to actually take it in to the place that still is, afraid of violating the Catholic authority, or still somehow vaguely,
Sin. It's
say again?
simply sin, right? Mortal sin,
Yeah,
venial sin. That's it.
yeah. The scent, so it is like, you have to find your own authority about that, and you have to take that truth in to the part of you that was conditioned and set it free. And the only authority that can do that is your own, followed and affirmed authority, right? So what do you know? What do is it a sin? Why is it not a sin? Like how do you know that? All of these things, you can activate inside of your adult and your higher self. If your adult doesn't know, you can call your higher self, is it really a sin? Right? And find the truth. The guide is always asking us to know the truth, right? And so our own inner authority has to make that discernment and bring it into the parts that have been conditioned with this poison, so we can set all of these parts free. I mean, that's really why we brought them in. It's like we have all these pain bodies. One of my hymns say, like all that isn't love, I came here to set free, right? I'm an instrument of the love that's inside of me that can set free all of these places that don't know love. So that's it's like what all of our pain bodies are waiting for. We're the savior, the Christ principle that can release them. So it says the combination between the pleasure principle and cruelty can exist either actively or passively. That is, pleasure is experienced either in inflicting cruelty or enduring it, or both. Attaching the pleasure principle to a condition where it functions most strongly in conjunction with cruelty creates a holding back from love, limits it, and makes the actual experience of love impossible. So, it's like the guide says in some way, there's a numbness already, right? So that we have to break through that numbness to feel something. But, it's like, it's really, love is this very open, sensitive, vulnerable experience. And so, we don't want to go there. And so there's this, holding back from love and sort of, I don't know, like many people use sarcasm or negativity. I think it's in the masculine culture even more than the women, to, be tough, and to, have a little cruelty there, a little one-upmanship, a little jab, and testing people to if they can take it, this kind of thing. And you can see how, there's the love that we're trying to go for can't really mature or come into being in that place. And it's not, again, to judge, because in some ways that's the best of intimacy, that the person can achieve, and yet to know that there's so much more, and there's a deep longing, and a deep aloneness really inside of that as well. And then some of them are toxic, and so we can't reach out, but there's I think to the degree that love exists within us, compassion and understanding also, and also for these parts within us that may arise. So love exists in this case only as a vague yearning that can't be maintained or followed through. And under these circumstances, love is not the tempting, pleasurable experience it may be to another part of the personality. The yearning for the pleasure of love and the ignorance about the fact that one rejects its actual experience because one fears the attachment of the pleasure principle to negativity often creates a deep hopelessness. So, and also you can see, like, if you knew that, you were attached to negativity and open to another person, that you cared about, then it would be a conflict because, maybe you would just act out that negativity on the person that you loved, but carrying that karmically, or maybe, you would be, really conflicted and try to control it, right? Which also won't lead to its healing. It says this hopelessness can be understood and relieved through when this particular fact is profoundly comprehended. This fact of, the cruelty attached to the pleasure principle. In the less crass cases, when the childhood experienced not so much outright cruelty, but vague rejection or non-acceptance, the pleasure principle will attach itself to a similar situation. So that in spite of the conscious desire for acceptance, the pleasure current will only be activated in conjunction with rejection. Right? This may resonate a little, or, you can recognize, especially where pattern and dynamic is there, and you may not, it's not pleasure like, oh, whoopee, this is wonderful, kind of pleasure, but it gives you purpose, it gives you meaning, it gives you, something, right, that makes you sort of tell your story, that makes you great or valuable or something in this, right? So, there's this attachment again, to the very like loss of what we really want, like the negative result in the recreation. And here you can see he's really going back to that lecture on recreation of childhood hurts. So notice, if there's a part of you that, how do you experience rejection? What happens to you in rejection? How do you, either become special in your special rejected state, or better than them, or, like how do you attach the pleasure principle to that experience? So there are many degrees and variations of this. There are, for example, situations where a child experiences partial acceptance and partial rejection. And then the pleasure principle is attached to an exactly similar ambivalence. And this then creates a conflict in actual relationships. The first, crass instance of attaching cruelty to the pleasure principle or the life principle, they are the same, will make a relationship so hazardous that it is often avoided altogether, or you find it so frightening that you are puzzled. You then feel incapable of following through with it, or you are so inhibited because the shame of the desire for either inflicting or enduring cruelty may prohibit all spontaneity and make you withdraw from and numb all feelings. And I think too, like sometimes relationships that are like really in a lot of drama and constantly in arguments, or, strong dynamics, one person starts warming up and the other person has to go into, some battle case. So, often there's, a kind of, active part there as well. So my dearest friends, this is a tremendous important principle to understand. It applies to humanity as a whole as well as to the individual. And generally, it has not been sufficiently understood because psychology and spiritual sciences have not merged sufficiently. Vague attempts have been made by psychology to grasp this factor, and it has been understood in some measure, but the vast significance in terms of civilization and its fate or its evolution is not understood. The world is now ready to understand this fact of life. So, here I think he's, saying like, like this is Wetico, right? It's going to evolve us or kill us, right? Are you guys familiar with the Wetico discussion of this kind of mind virus, right? That we're all infected with, it's many of what the guide, talks about. And so, it is the thing that will either wake us up or take us down. And so the similar thing. So evolution, my friends, means that each individual, through the process of personal self-confrontation and self-realization, gradually changes the inner orientation of the pleasure principle. And, truly what we're talking about, this mobility and relaxation, I mean, can you really imagine anything more pleasurable, right? This is what we long for. This is the real thing, right? To be, in the flow and forgetting about all of ourself in some way, letting spirit move through us. And oftentimes when we're channeling in that way, like our brilliance shines or our, particular gifts come through, when we're stepping out of the way of ourselves. And so all of this is part of that mobility and relaxation that we're, is the true pleasure that we're trying to evolve towards. So you all know that such interchange cannot be willed directly. The direct expression of your outer will can and must go in the direction of maintaining and sustaining a pathwork such as this, which increases the ability to understand and cultivate the will and the courage to look at the self, to find and overcome resistance. And as you do this, as you use your will and your ego faculties in this constructive manner, the real change happens, as some of you begin to experience, almost as though it had nothing to do with these efforts, as if it were a byproduct, an unconnected unfoldment. That is the real thing. This is the way progress and growth must happen. Gradually, through this process of growth, one individual after another reorients the soul movements, the soul forces. The expression of the cosmic movement within, and the psyche will then attach itself to purely positive conditions and circumstances. Positive or pleasurable feelings will no longer be derived from negative circumstances. You are now used to the latter, hence you repress and suppress the combination of pleasurable feelings and negative events. Instead of repressing it, denying it, looking away from it, you must face it. As you face it and understand it without guilt or shame, you must learn in the course of growing that all imperfection must be accepted and understood before it can be changed. So to the extent that you succeed in facing and understanding your conflict, the pleasure principle will run in different channels. As this happens, mobility will exist without tension and anxiety, and relaxation will exist without stagnation. All of you, my friends, try to find your specific inner marriage between the pleasure current and the negative condition. As you find this marriage within your soul forces in specific terms, you will know and perfectly understand certain outer manifestations of your problems. The relief of thorough understanding can come about only when you have the courage to face this marriage. As you become capable of clearly and concisely formulating this marriage of positive and negative forces, you will clearly see the exact image of your unfulfillment. You will see why you keep yourself hidden from yourself and from life, why you withdrew from your own feelings, why you repress, and why you stand guard over the most spontaneous and creative forces within yourself. You will see why you block out feelings, sometimes with a great amount of pain, and then try to rationalize and explain them away. Even currently fashionable psychological truths serve to camouflage this simple process, my friends. Make attempts to find the two factors I have discussed. First, discover the subtle but nevertheless distinct distortion of the unitive principle of mobility and relaxation. Where do you have mobility and tension? Where do you have relaxation and stagnation or immobility? Observe them in your mental makeup, in your emotions, as well as in your body. Second, discover in what respect the life and pleasure principle is attached to a negative condition. To what extent does this manifest? Perhaps in your fantasies. And how does this hold you back from self-expression, from union, from experience, from a fearless state of self-realization with a kindred spirit? And then he goes into some Q&As. So, any comments here? How are we doing? I want to cover the Q&As here. Skip the first one. Question, I would like to understand a little more concretely about this marriage between the forces of love and circumstances of, for example, cruelty. For instance, in the case of children who feel rejected by their mother, does this marriage mean that the person cannot experience pleasure without also experiencing revenge, some kind of sadistic wish toward the mother? This happens perhaps only in fantasy, never in reality. And then the person is usually unaware that the partner represents the mother. Answer, yes, it might be exactly that, or it might also be that pleasure can be experienced only in connection with being rejected again, or a little rejected, or being fearful that rejection may occur. Does that make sense? There's a little excitement, or there's a little, anticipation somehow in there, and then maybe through the defense mechanism, we know the story, it's a familiar story, and somehow we're still the hero or the righteous one or something, right? So he said, but they didn't experience pleasure when they were rejected. Of course not. But the child uses the pleasure principle to make the negative event, the suffering, more bearable. This happens unconsciously, unintentionally, and almost automatically. Inadvertently, as it were, the pleasure principle combines with a negative condition. The only way this can be determined is by investigation of one's fantasy life. It is that way that the marriage is established. The automatic reflexes are then geared to a situation that combines the inherent pleasure current with the painful event. Question, and the child wishes to reproduce this rejection? Not consciously, of course. No one really wants to be rejected. The trouble is that people consciously wish to be accepted and loved, but unconsciously, they cannot respond to a completely accepting and favorable situation. So this is very true, right? That, we deeply long for this, but somehow, we can't really open and receive it. So in such cases, the pleasure principle has already been led into the negative channel and can be rechanneled only through awareness and understanding. The very nature of this conflict is that the pleasure principle functions the way people consciously want least of all. So, we're always stuck here, frustrated here, like, why am I, here am I again, why am I still here? And so he's saying, this is where if you can look a little deeper and see if you can find this attachment of the life force somehow to the situation, that can be a good key and help to release yourself. So it cannot be said that a person unconsciously desires rejection, but the reflex was already established in time when this way of functioning made life more bearable for the child. Do you understand that? And I mean, who knows, it could have been, rejection was better than, like somehow, cruelty, right? That may have been the second better choice even. So Question again, I don't quite understand how pleasure can be experienced at all when someone is rejected, except in the form of revenge. That I can understand. Answer, perhaps you can imagine also, one sees this over and over again, that when people feel too secure in being accepted and loved, they lose the spark of interest. This too is rationalized by claiming it to be an inevitable law happening through habit or other circumstance. But it would not have to be that way if it were not for the factors discussed in this lecture. The spark, the interest, the dynamic flow exists only when there is an unsure or, unhappy, risky situation, right? Somehow the allure of the chase or the possibility of the loss, adds some kind of, interest or diciness that oftentimes we're addicted to. So you see this frequently. Sometimes the negative condition manifests only in fantasies. These fantasies are, when closely examined in one way or another, attached to suffering, humiliation, or hostility. So I don't know, those of you that have done the transformation program in year 3, I think they work with this lecture, and really do kind of explore what are your sexual fantasies, right? So you might explore that and look at it in the light of what this lecture is saying. So question, since all children experience rejection, and since all children are insatiable in their demands, when will there be an end to this situation? It always starts with each incarnation and each situation again. Answer, you can see that there are differences among human beings. Some function in a much healthier way than others, and their pleasure principle responds more strongly to a positive situation. Their evolution is taking place. When a completely positive situation exists in the psyche, reincarnation is no longer necessary. Evolution then proceeds on other levels. To a certain degree, every human being has negativity, and this negativity is somehow activated, enforced, and nourished by the life force. So that can be another approach. It's like, like your negativity wouldn't stay alive, and so like, how do you keep it alive? Right? What is it that you do consciously or unconsciously to feed it, in a sense? You have human beings at one extreme who cannot even have any direct relationship with another person, who live merely in fantasies that are utterly attached to negative experiences. At the other extremes are those in the process of maturing, have brought together fantasy and reality in the most positive and favorable sense. This bringing together of fantasy and reality does not mean repression of fantasy life, but true overcoming of it, because reality is more desirable and more pleasurable, just as positive circumstances are. And I don't know if you can even think of it, in the sexual act itself, right? This mobility and relaxation is the key to, full orgasmic potency, is what, as Reich would call it, right? So, to the degree that we, can't relax into the pleasure of the sexual force coming through us, and we may kind of tense or push or, grasp, then we lose it, right? And if we can flow with it, it's another experience. So this bringing together of fantasy and reality does not mean repression of fantasy life, but true overcoming of it, because reality is more desirable and more pleasurable, just as positive circumstances are. Between these poles, many degrees can exist. Question, do mobility and tension and relaxation and stagnation lessen as you remove the pleasure principle from the negative? Of course, one interacts with the other. You can see how the interaction between these two facets works. To the extent that a combination or marriage takes place between the life or pleasure principle and a negative situation, tension must exist, anxiety must exist. To the extent that anxiety and tension exist, immobility appears, a welcome relief from the effort and fatigue to struggle against the self. When a short circuit hinders the real experience of the pleasure principle, that in itself is stagnation, no inspiration, right? Comes through from that pleasure principle. It is a non-movement, whereas the whole cosmos is in perpetual, beautiful motion. When you establish the same cosmic movement within your own psyche, you are in harmony with the cosmic forces. So this is the clearest understanding I've ever had of what has happened to me in this marriage of negativity and the pleasure principle. I had to set up a rejection, seeing it as clearly as I do now, recognizing exactly how it operates. What do I do now about it? It is extremely important that you become aware of the specific negative condition to which the pleasure principle in you reacts. This awareness must be not only intellectual, but actually felt and experienced. You must remove the restriction to allow this into your consciousness. Realize that allowing it into your consciousness is not a devastating judgment. It is not the end of you. It does not stamp you as lost, as you unconsciously believe, but rather the opposite. And here again, that the guy is saying, we bring in these states, to transform, they're part of our soul mission. And he says, what dignity in another lecture, to understand that, these are, parts of our spiritual task. And we are the light that can help these places that are negatively attached. So this is a new beginning and a way out of an erroneously assumed devastating judgment that you thought applied to you. When you allow the clear-cut, concise formulation of this particular melding point into your emotional experience, when you experience with courage how the automatic reflexes of the pleasure principle are geared to the negative, knowing that this need not and will not remain as you quietly and calmly desire to grow, then you cannot help but progress. In this connection, I would like to add one more point, not just for you, but generally. It is also useful, my friends, to distinguish between two prevalent reactions to this conflict. Both of them are mostly unconscious. The first is strict denial, so that no awareness, even in fantasy, exists. And this comes from fear, guilt, and shame, and the belief that one is terrible because of it. The second applies to those who are perfectly aware of their fantasies, but are unable to experience the pleasure principle in any other way, whether or not they actually have relationships with others. It occurs when sex and love are separated, or eros and love, or eros and sex. In these cases, the semi-conscious resistance to giving up this fantasy life exists out of fear that the pleasure will be lost altogether. It then cannot be conceived that the pure healthy pleasure principle manifests much more beautifully and satisfyingly when positive melds with positive. It is imagined this would be dull and boring. This is concluded because the actual real life relationship in such instances is never as satisfying as the fantasy. Hence, one assumes that giving up the fantasy means giving up the pleasure. So one does not wish to part with one's pleasure. It is important to distinguish which of the two resistances applies to you first. Is it the denial of the link between the automatic reflex of pleasure in a negative situation, or is it the clinging to the entire complex out of fear of having to do without any pleasure? Both resistances are the result of misconceptions. These particular resistances, for example, create a confusion of motions, either the strained mobility of striving away from what is now, hence effort, tension, fear, or not wanting to change out of fear of losing out in the process, hence stagnation. As I said at the beginning of this lecture, all dichotomy, all duality can be reduced to the simple common denominator of this basic split movement. When you see this, you will find it quite helpful. There is no doubt, my dearest ones, that every one of you who truly wishes will find more and more the beauty, the peace, dynamic life, inner security that exists in the self-realization you have begun to cultivate. Hence, you experience moments of living in the eternal now of yourself instead of striving away from it. Each now must bring you answers. If you recall this simple fact in your meditation, in your approach to yourself, your meditations will become more fruitful as you go on. What you have to look forward to in the time to come will be even more liberating than what you have already begun to experience. Be blessed, be in peace, and be in God. Okay, I guess we lost Jasmine, but kind of a hard lecture to get in the middle of. Any final comments here?
The sexual part's really related to me, so it was a good lecture for me, especially the very last couple of paragraphs. So,
Yeah.
but it was hard getting through much the back end of the lecture. So, but I managed to make it stay with you on it. So, thank you, Darlene.
Yeah, and you know, keep practicing mobility and relaxation. In the Daime, in Brazil, I would be so anxious and fearful and uptight, and all the little Brazilian ladies would come by and say, "Relax, relax."
I love it. It'd be good to go down there sometime too.
Yeah.
Okay, have a good night, and Frank, take care.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you, Darlene.
Yeah. Take care. Good to see everybody again. We'll see you in 2 weeks.
Okay.